071 November Pop is SoCal.
SoCal 1 November Pop, we can sometimes hear you calling, but we've got severe interference in the clouds here.
That recording is from a VisionJet trip I took last fall, and in this episode, we'll answer the questions, just what is that awful noise, and what can I do about it? Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation, with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott, the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we'll be talking about precipitation static, or P-static, how it occurs and what you can do about it. And so that you don't miss next week's episode in whatever app you're listening to us now, it's really easy. Take a moment, look for that subscribe or the follow key, touch that, and next week's episode will be downloaded for free. Last week in episode 263, we talked with author and pilot examiner John Ewing about the technology and performance of the Diamond DA-42 twin-engine aircraft, as well as tips for flying these aircraft. And we also had a Friday mailbag episode, number 264, in which we talked about the new alternative phrase for declaring an emergency, which is requesting priority handling. So if you didn't hear those episodes, check them out at aviationnewstalk.com/263 and 264. So if you're learning something from this show, please take the 2 or 3 minutes it takes to sign up and become a member to join the club and support Aviation News Talk. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. But of course, there's a link for that website in our show notes. This week in the news, FAA issues an AD affecting Continental 6-cylinder engines. Alaska Airlines has 2 tail scrapes within minutes of each other, and we'll tell you why. And we'll tell you why ATC was asking a pilot about a train. All this and more, and the news starts now. From a newsletter from SavvyAviation.com, FAA issues AD for Continental engine counterweight inspection. The FAA has issued an emergency direct-to-final rule, AD 2023-04-08, affecting all Continental 360, 470, 520, 550, and GT-SIO 520 engines whose crankshaft assemblies were manufactured, installed, or repaired on or after June 1st, 2021. This AD mandates an inspection of the counterweight retaining rings, or circlips, to ensure that they were fully seated. The inspection involves removing 1, 2, or 3 cylinders from the right side of the engine, depending upon the engine model, and checking each of the circlips with a special measuring tool. An estimated 2,176 crankshaft assemblies are affected, of which an estimated 1,632 are installed in aircraft of U.S. registry. The AD was triggered by reports of 2 ground engine seizures and 1 in-flight loss of oil pressure, all traced to improper installation of the circlips during manufacture by Continental Motors. And the AD is considerably more restrictive than the mandatory service bulletin that was issued in that it does not exempt engines with more than 200 hours time in service, and it requires compliance before further flight, although it does allow for ferry permits if the oil filter is cut open and no significant metal is found. The good news is that Continental will be paying for these inspections under warranty. The bad news is that owners may have a difficult time getting these inspections on their maintenance shop schedule, since most shops seem to be booked up for months in advance. From AOPA.org, wing spar inspection results raise FAA concern. The FAA pushed back on commenters seeking to reduce the scope of an airworthiness directive to inspect wing spar components on certain Cessna 210 and 177 models, citing the results of inspections performed to date. The final AD, published February 13th and effective March 20th, was proposed in May 2021 following the in-flight breakup of Cessna 210M in Australia in 2019. An FAA estimated 3,421 U.S. registered aircraft were to be subject to visual and eddy current inspections of the lower wing spar carry-through cap. The final AD cites the same number of aircraft and continues to require one-time visual and eddy current inspection of the same wing spar components. The FAA estimates that required inspections will cost $3,108 per aircraft, up to $3,788 if oxygen and air conditioning must be removed for inspection access. Comments on the proposed AD noted that no Cessna 177 wings have failed in flight, and that service difficulty reports did not support the inclusion of that model in the AD. The FAA disagreed, citing the failure rate of Cessna 177 wing spar inspections to date. Quote, out of the 211 Model 177 series reports received by the FAA as of January 13, 2023, 120 have reported corrosion, the agency wrote in the final AD. Of those, at least 14 were removed from service due to corrosion or damage. The 14 Cessna 177 spars taken out of service following inspections to date have not likely been replaced with new parts. The FAA noted that Textron Aviation is still working to develop a replacement spar for those aircraft long out of production. None of the later model Cessna 210s inspected to date had spars taken out of service due to corrosion too severe to grind down and leave enough structure to remain in service, the FAA noted, though 2 Cessna 210 spars were removed from service due to damage. Just under 7% of the newer 210s had any corrosion found on inspection. Among the older Cessna 210s, the rate of corrosion discovery was much higher, 47%. The FAA noted, however, that while the rate of corrosion discovery was lower, the newer Cessna 210 models are more susceptible to spar failure if the structure becomes compromised. Quote, analysis completed by Textron revealed that later Model 210 series airplanes, due to their weight and configuration, demonstrate higher stress levels in operation when compared to earlier Model 210 series airplanes. Therefore, the critical crack length, the length at which the crack reduces the capability of the structure below that provided in the certification basis, is smaller in the later Model 210 series airplanes. From aerotime.aero, NTSB targets flap retraction crew action on United altitude loss in Hawaii. The NTSB, which began its inquiry into the sudden loss of altitude on a United Airlines flight following takeoff on February 14th, will look into the position of the aircraft flaps during the initial phase of the flight, as well as the actions of the crew. The NTSB indicated that it would produce a preliminary report in the next 2 to 3 weeks. According to a report by the Air Current, citing sources familiar with the matter, the NTSB will focus on how and when the United Boeing 777's flaps were retracted and the actions of the 2 pilots during departure from Kaului Airport in Hawaii. On December 18, 2022, the United Airlines Boeing 777, registered November 212 Uniform Alpha, departed OGG toward its scheduled destination at SFO. Seconds after takeoff from the Hawaiian Islands, the wide-body jet descended steeply, moving from 2,200 feet of altitude to 775 feet. From avweb.com, flaps prop mix-up may have led to Nepal crash. Nepalese authorities say an instructor pilot on the Yeti Airlines ATR 72 that crashed in Pokhara in January may have inadvertently feathered both props while trying to lower the flaps. The plane crashed while on final for the new airport in the Nepalese resort town and was a familiarization flight for the other pilot. A translation of the Nepalese Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission preliminary report says data from the cockpit voice and flight data recorder suggests that as the crew set up for landing, the instructor pilot pulled the wrong lever. The flap and prop levers are next to each other in the ATR 72. Quote, at 10:56, the pilot flying disengaged the autopilot system at an altitude of 720 feet AGL. The PF then called for flaps 30 at 10:56:32, and the PM pilot monitoring replied flaps 30 and descending, the report said. The flight data recorder did not record any flap surface movement at that time. Instead, the propeller rotational speed of both engines decreased simultaneously to less than 25%, and the torque started decreasing to 0%, which is consistent with both propellers going into the feathered condition. When propellers are in feather, they are not producing thrust. Video shows the aircraft slowing and then falling off to the left. It crashed on the edge of a gorge, and all 71 people aboard were killed. Weather was benign at the time. The airport had been open for less than 2 weeks, and Yeti was one of the first carriers to use it. Both pilots were captains, and the pilot flying was doing a check ride into the new airport. From ADN.com, that's the Anchorage Daily News, after Alaska Airlines planes bump runway while taking off from Seattle, a scramble to pull the plug. On the morning of January 26th, as 2 Alaska Airlines flights from Seattle to Hawaii lifted off 6 minutes apart, the pilots each felt a slight bump, and the flight attendants at the back of the cabin heard a scraping noise. As the noses of both 737s lifted skyward on takeoff, their tails had scraped the runway. Both planes circled back immediately and landed again at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Tail strikes happen occasionally in aviation, but 2 in quick succession was not normal. Brett Payton, Alaska's on-duty director of operations, immediately ordered no more planes were to take off across the airline's network. All Alaska flights not already airborne were stopped nationwide. Payton said, quote, "At that point, 2 in a row like that, that's when I said, no, we're done. That's when I stopped things." The stoppage lasted just 22 minutes. Alaska's flight operations staff quickly realized that a software bug was sending bad takeoff weight data to its crews. They immediately figured out a workaround and normal flying resumed. To determine the thrust and speed settings for takeoff, Alaska's pilots and others use a performance calculation tool supplied by a Swedish company called Dynamic Source. It delivers a message to the cockpit with crucial weight and balance data, including how many people are on board, the jet's empty and gross weight, and the position of its center of gravity. In a cockpit check before takeoff, this data is entered into the flight computer to determine how much thrust the engine will provide and what speed the jet will be ready to lift off. A pilot at American Airlines, which uses the same Dynamic Source performance data tool and who spoke anonymously because he didn't have authorization, explained that the computer then calculates just the right amount of engine thrust so the pilots don't use more than necessary. Quote, "The goal is to lower the power used on takeoff," he said. "That reduces engine wear and saves money on fuel and maintenance." Flights to Hawaii are typically full with lots of baggage and a full load of fuel for the trip across the ocean. The planes are heavy. That morning, a software bug and an update to the Dynamic Source tool caused it to provide seriously undervalued weights for the airplanes. The Alaska 737 captain said the data was on the order of 20 to 30,000 pounds light. With a total weight of those jets at 150 to 170,000 pounds, the error was enough to skew the engine thrust and speed settings. Both planes headed down the runway with less power and at lower speed than they should have. And with the jets judged lighter than they actually were, the pilots rotated too early. Both the MAX 9 and the 737-900ER have long passenger cabins, which makes them more vulnerable to a tail strike when the nose comes up too soon. Alaska says it operated 727 flights that day, of which just 30 took off with incorrect takeoff data. Only those 2 Hawaii-bound aircraft had tail strikes. A quick interim fix proved easy. When operations staff turned off the automatic uplink of the data to the aircraft and switched to manual request, quote, "We didn't have the bug anymore." Payton said his team also checked the integrity of the calculation itself before lifting the stoppage. All that was accomplished in 20 minutes. The software code was permanently repaired after 5 hours. Payton added that even though the update to the Dynamic Source software had been tested over an extended period, the bug was missed because it only presented itself when many aircraft at the same time were using the software. Subsequently, a test of the software under high demand was developed. Payton said the airline's leadership has been very supportive of his decision to pull the plug that January morning. Quote, "We needed to stop the operation. It was very clear to me that within a very short period of time, and I'm glad we did. I didn't walk into work that morning thinking I would stop a major airline," Payton added. "What it says to me is that I'm empowered to do so, and so is every employee here. It's part of our safety culture." That's a great story, and congratulations to Brett Payton, who's a former Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, for making the right decision at the right time. And I think that's something that we should all do, which is anytime we see something that's not right, we need to take action immediately. From GeneralAviationNews.com, contaminated fuel contributes to crash. The pilot departed from Mid-Valley Dusters Airport 43TX in Alamo, Texas, on the last flight of the day, and noticed an abnormal sound from the engines as the Aero Commander S2R reached an altitude of about 25 feet above ground. He elected to make an immediate precautionary landing rather than risk having the engine lose power over obstacles farther along the departure path, including a high-traffic highway and a low power line. During the landing roll, both wings sustained substantial damage due to impact with trees. The rear carburetor bowl drain was removed, and an examination found a small amount of water-contaminated fuel. Probable cause, the partial loss of engine power due to water-contaminated fuel. And also from GeneralAviationNews.com, distractions interrupt pilot's pre-landing checklist. The pilot reported that while in the traffic pattern at the airport in Tucson, Arizona, he was distracted by radio transmissions from the tower controller regarding maintaining his airspeed and multiple landing runway reassignments. His pre-landing check was interrupted, and he did not lower the landing gear and landed gear up on the runway. The Beech G35 sustained substantial damage to the undercarriage. The pilot added that he was wearing noise-canceling headsets and did not hear the warning horn. During the airplane recovery, the pilot reported that the throttle was in the retarded position and the warning horn was blaring. The landing gear handle was placed in the down position and extended normally. Probable cause, the pilot's distraction in the cockpit, which interrupted his pre-landing checklist, which resulted in his failure to configure the landing gear prior to touchdown. From BBC.com, video release of captured New Zealand pilot by Papua separatist. Separatist fighters in Indonesia's Papua region have released video footage of a New Zealand pilot taken hostage 7 days ago. Philip Mertens was kidnapped after landing his plane in Papua's remote mountainous province of Nduja. In the video sent to the BBC's Indonesian service, Mr. Mertens was surrounded by 7 West Papua National Liberation Army fighters. They pledged to release the pilot if Papua was granted independence. Previously a Dutch colony, Papua declared independence in 1961, but Indonesia took control 2 years later. The resource-rich region has been caught in a battle for independence ever since it was brought under Jakarta's formal control in a UN-supervised vote in 1969. The 37-year-old was kidnapped after his small passenger plane, which belongs to Indonesia's Suzy Air, landed in Nduja. But shortly after landing, rebels stormed the single-engine plane and seized the Christchurch native. The spokesperson for the National Liberation Army later told BBC Indonesia that Mr. Mertens had been moved to a stronghold district for the group in a remote area and would be used as leverage in political negotiations. From ChristianPost.com, court denies bail for Missionary pilot, 2 MAF volunteers imprisoned in Mozambique. The Mission Aviation Fellowship, or MAF, pilot's wife asked Christians worldwide to join them in prayer every Wednesday. A court in Mozambique has denied bail for Ryan Coher, a pilot for the U.S.-based ministry Mission Aviation Fellowship, and 2 of the organization's South African volunteers who were arrested more than 4 months ago, allegedly on suspicion of supporting insurgent activity. Coher, 31, and 2 South Africans were detained in a coastal city on November 4th while they were loading supplies into the aircraft to be taken to the church-run orphanage. Their request for bail was denied earlier this month. In an update Friday, MAF said Coher's wife, Annabelle, is thankful for the continued prayers and fasting on behalf of her husband. On Wednesday, hundreds of people from around the world joined MAF's Day of Global Prayer and Fasting for Coher, the ministry said. In an earlier statement, MAF assured that the 3 men were not supporting an insurgency because the organization has, quote, long sought to care for those who have been harmed by the insurgency, including evacuating innocent residents following a March 2021 insurgent attack. Ryan's release and a safe return home remain the top priority, MAF said, urging everyone to continue to pray for his well-being and a positive resolution to this case. And in another story from the BBC.com, and this one's a little odd, pilot thought co-pilot who died in the cockpit was joking. A pilot continued to fly after his co-pilot suffered a cardiac arrest and died, believing he was playing a joke. The pilot believed his colleague was pretending to be asleep and only realized what had happened after landing, a safety report revealed. The Air Accidents Investigation Branch investigated the accident in Blackpool. It concluded current medical assessments were acceptable, but risk can never be reduced to 0. The report found the pilot who died was flying with a qualified pilot who was able to handle the aircraft safely, but said the outcome could have been different on a different flight. The 57-year-old, who'd passed a medical 4 months earlier, had agreed to join the short journey aboard a Piper PA 28161 around Blackpool Airport in June. A second pilot had been requested for safety reasons due to the windy weather conditions. The surviving pilot recalled how during the taxi the pair were talking normally, and his colleague, who was also a flight instructor, had remarked, "Looks good, there is nothing behind you." His head then rolled back, and the pilot, who knew the instructor well, thought he was pretending to take a nap, the report said. As the plane turned, the instructor slumped over, his head resting on the pilot's shoulder. The report said, quote, the pilot still thought the instructor was just joking with him and continued to fly the approach. He later landed normally before he realized something was wrong and made a call for help. A review by the Civil Aviation Authority's medical department concluded the instructor had died from acute cardiac arrest. And finally from avweb.com, train spotting. This comes from a story written by a pilot in Northern California. He writes, "We were new to the area and flying out of Arcata, California, KACV, which, by the way, may have the longest name of any GA airport in the U.S., California Redwood Coast Humboldt County Airport. A few miles up the coast, we contacted Seattle Center. After a radar contact was confirmed, the controller asked, 'Do you have the train in sight?' At least that's what we thought. We looked around and reported, no, we don't see a train, and we don't see any tracks either. After a pause, the controller said, enunciating carefully, can you see the terrain? Do you see the terrain in sight? We responded, oh, yes, we have the ground clearly. It was a beautiful, clear day. What we didn't know at the time was that KACV is known for frequent thick coastal fog, so much so, in fact, that in World War II, the U.S. Navy built the field to test defogging systems. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates, and later we'll talk about Precipitation Static or P-Static, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to Mark Newton, who sent me a video of his great-looking panel in his RV6, and he wrote, just finished off my Australian private IFR rating in my van's RV6. Well, congratulations, Mark. And I met Mark back in 2019 when I was visiting Australia. And also congratulations to Shane McFarland. He says, I just received my private. Your podcast helped me tremendously. Thanks again, Shane McFarland, Air Mayor. So maybe he's the mayor of a town. I'm not sure. We'll have to find out about that. And here's a note that I sent to the chief pilot of another flying club at my home airport. Not the one that I teach at, because I was headed out at night and an airplane started up with no warning, no lights, nobody yelling clear. So I thought I would let him know about it. I tried to soft pedal it slightly, and I said this wasn't a huge deal, but when I see pilots forgetting to do the little things correctly, I worry that they're also not paying attention to other details. They were in violation of 91.209B, so you may want to chat with them. This occurred about 7:25 p.m. on such and such night. I was about 30 to 40 feet from the plane when it started. I never heard anyone call clear, so I was surprised that there was anyone in the plane. When I looked over at it, I was surprised to see that it also didn't have any lights on. I continued to watch it as I walked to my plane, and perhaps 10 seconds later, the red anti-collision beacon came on. I was flying with the owner of a blah, blah, blah aircraft, which was parked right in front of that airplane, and when I reached him, he said he also never heard anyone call clear. Perhaps it's not a big deal to do this in the daytime, but it's especially bad to do this at night when people are walking around and have no idea a plane is about to start. And if you wonder about, well, do I really need that anti-collision light turned on when I start the airplane? I went out to find an FAA legal interpretation on this. It's one thing to read the rules, but it's another thing to find the FAA's legal interpretation of the rules, because that's what really counts. And there's a database of these legal interpretations, and you can search it. This is the Murphy legal interpretation regarding the point at which the anti-collision lights must be turned on. And they have a lot of background information, but they summarize at the end by saying, as the FAA's 1979 letter points out, an aircraft is being operated when its engine is turned on with the intent of using that aircraft to take off and engage in air navigation. As such, 91.209B requires that an aircraft's anti-collision lights be turned on once that aircraft's engine is started for the purpose of air navigation. As a safety precaution, the anti-collision lights should be on before starting an engine or causing a propeller or rotor to turn. And in that interpretation, they also addressed whether, for aircraft that have both a rotating beacon and strobe lights, whether they must both be turned on. And they wrote that in the preamble to the final rule creating the regulation that ultimately became 91.209B, the FAA recognized several commenters who raised concerns that the use of strobe light as an anti-collision light would create an unsafe condition during certain aircraft operations, such as taxiing, takeoff, and landing. The FAA agreed that the use of a high-intensity anti-collision light, such as a strobe light, could create unsafe conditions by inducing vertigo and causing spatial disorientation. As a result, the FAA amended the pertinent regulatory language to give the PIC the discretion to control how many lights are turned on in the anti-collision system in the interest of safety. And I came across a video that you might be interested in. I think most of us dream of, hey, wouldn't it be great to live on an air park, have our hangar right there, be able to walk from our home to the airplane and taxi to the runway. And this 8-minute video appeared in CNBC.com, and it's extremely well produced. It's meant for the general public, not for pilots, but I think you're going to enjoy it. The description says, Joe Subchak, 69, lives in a residential air park in Groveland, California. He bought the home in 2017 for $698,000 and pays $4,000 a month in mortgage. He commutes to the Bay Area in a Beechcraft T-34 Mentor airplane, where he works for a major U.S. airline as a flight test pilot. Anyway, you might enjoy this, so I'll include a link to it in the show notes. And I also ran across a short video that's very funny. It's of a pilot making the in-cabin announcement after landing in New York. But guess what? He made that announcement on the tower frequency, and the controller jumps in and invites pilots to let him have it. Here's what that sounded like.
Right behind that Lufthansa 747. Once he exits the alleyway there, we'll be able to make a right turn and head into the gate area. Thank you for remaining seated until I will turn off the seatbelt sign once we park at the gate. Until that time, please remain seated. Again, welcome to New York. It's a beautiful evening here, about 70 degrees right now.
Let the abuse start. Come on, you can't let him get away with that.
Nice briefing. Hey, welcome to New York.
Welcome to New York.
Thank you. Good to be here.
What was the temperature again?
Where's our gate?
And I heard a similar announcement like that one time on guard frequency, and boy, did everybody on guard frequency jump in and let this guy have it. So, yep, sometimes pilots, even airline pilots, push the wrong button, so it's funny at times. And I've got a number of listener emails that I'm going to read in our Mailbag Friday edition. So if you want to contact me and send me your feedback, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, then click on Contact at the top of the page. And aviation is a very small community, so take a listen and see if you recognize the names of any of these listeners who took the time during the past week to sign up as a member and join the club to support the show. And I greatly appreciate this because we've had a number of members drop out in the last few months for financial reasons. I know the economy is starting to hit some people. But special thanks to Thomas Giger. He signed up for the $200 a month level, and he said, I may only do that for a couple months, and that's fine, Thomas. We greatly appreciate the support. He says, I'm a student pilot currently working on my private pilot certificate. I am currently flying a rental 172 that is 13 years older than I am, and I'm 50. Thomas, I hope you're having fun, and thanks so much for your support. Also, we have two new mega supporters who are donating $50 a month, Drew Anderson and Shane McFarland, and I'll tell you more about them in a future show. These people are signed up at the $20 a month level, so they get access to all my videos. Forrest Jesperson, Andrew Sambell, and Ray Hodges. Sam Hinkle has signed up at $35 a month level, so he has access to my online courses. And Greg Botla signed up at the $8 a month level, so he gets access to the show notes that I post. Also, we had a one-time donation via PayPal, also from Forrest Jeppesen for $200. Thanks to everyone who supports the show. If you'd like to sign up, you can go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to sign up via Patreon, or make a one-time donation via PayPal at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Coming up next, we're talking about Precipitation Static, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about precipitation static, sometimes called P-static. P-static is a phenomenon that can affect aircraft in flight, particularly in areas of high humidity or where there is precipitation. It's a form of electrostatic discharge that can interfere with your aircraft's communication and navigation systems. I first encountered it on a long trip that I flew 30 years ago on a Cessna 182 from Northern California to Scottsdale, Arizona. That was the flight I talked about in episode 227, in which I had a near-fatal icing encounter on the return trip to California. Here's a short clip from that episode on how that trip came about. At that time, I'd been a private pilot for 16 years, but had only accumulated a total of 305 hours, as college, my first job, buying a house, and raising a family had all taken priority. I'd passed my instrument rating 3 years earlier, but had little instrument experience other than flying around with safety pilots to accumulate 6 hours of instrument time every 6 months, which was what was required at the time to stay current. About the longest trip I'd flown was 135 miles from San Francisco Bay Area to South Lake Tahoe. So when my wife said she wanted our family to visit her brother, who lived near Scottsdale, Arizona, I sensed an opportunity. I proposed that I fly my wife and 2 girls, ages 6 and 3, in a Cessna 182 to Scottsdale, a trip of 570 nautical miles. My wife has never been particularly fond of flying, and the compromise we reached was that I would fly to Scottsdale with my 6-year-old, and then after our visit, fly back home with our 3-year-old. My wife would fly commercial both ways, taking one of our daughters with her on each leg. Now, the trip to Scottsdale was uneventful, but on the trip home, I foolishly punched into the side of a dark wall of clouds for a storm that had moved in faster than predicted, and I did so at 14,000 feet without having given any thought to the icing and the P-static I would encounter. Here's what happened next. It still amazes me today that when I punched into the side of that cloud, I still had not yet given any thought as to what the outside temperature was. Now, I'm sure you've already guessed that at 14,000 feet in March, the temperature was well below zero and that I would pick up ice, but that hadn't crossed my mind. As I entered the clouds, it seemed to start snowing inside the cockpit. I immediately closed the overhead air vents, which turned off the snow. The water still dripped in through the vent. Within a short period of time, the aircraft began to slow, and the engine RPM started dropping. So not only was I picking up ice on the airplane, but I was also getting carburetor ice in the engine. I told ATC that I was picking up ice and needed lower, and they descended me to 12,000 feet. I also began using the carburetor heat. When I applied it, the RPM would drop even further. Eventually, it would melt the carburetor ice, and when I turned the carb heat off, I would have more power than I started with. So I was handling the carburetor ice, but I was still picking up airframe ice at 12,000 feet. I requested lower and was given 10,000 feet. At some point, I lost the VOR signal that I was using to navigate with. I'm guessing that some of the static wicks on the wings were old and ineffective, and that static electricity building up on the wings was interfering with VOR reception. When I lost the VOR signal, I called ATC and told them that I would just fly my current heading. Oddly, they didn't give me a vector to fly, probably because I think they sensed that I was already in over my head. So that was from episode 227, and if you hadn't heard it, it's really an excellent discussion on icing. I'd encourage you to check that out at aviationnewstalk.com/227. And spoiler alert, yeah, I survived. But it was just pure luck that I did. I was over mountains, and the MEA along my route was 7,000 feet, and I wouldn't be able to go any lower. Fortunately, the ice came off as I reached 7,000 feet. I just missed a bullet, and at the time I didn't fully appreciate how lucky I was that it wasn't a few degrees colder outside. If I were in a similar situation today, I would have noted the outside air temperature before I entered the clouds, and or at the first sign of icing, I would have made a 180-degree turn to exit the icing. But let's get back to P-static. I mentioned that the VOR receiver stopped working because of the static, but the signal did return after perhaps 20 minutes of flying through the worst of the storm. It's quite likely that at the time, I also heard loud static over the comm radio while talking to ATC, but it's been so long ago that I don't recall. But I have picked up P-static on the comm radio on 2 recent trips, which triggered me to talk about it today. The first of those trips was on a Vision jet while climbing out of Van Nuys, California, when there was convective activity in the area. Fortunately, I had my GoPro cameras running at the time, and I recorded the entire incident on video. I recently uploaded that video, and Patreon supporters at the $20 a month level can view it. And in a moment, I'll play a portion of the audio from that video. In that particular case, the P-static was so loud that we were unable to hear ATC for perhaps 90 seconds. Eventually, it started to get a little quieter, and then we were able to hear them again. And in those circumstances, even though you cannot hear ATC, they most likely can still hear you. So you can certainly update them. Tell them you have heavy P-static at the moment and can't hear them, and that you'll call them back when the static starts to die down. You can also tell them of your intentions if you plan to change course or altitude. Now let's talk about the causes of P-static, and later we'll talk about some of the things you can do about it. Now there's an excellent article that was written on the subject nearly 30 years ago by John F. O'Neill Jr., and it appeared in the Flight Safety Foundation's Aviation Mechanics Bulletin, and I'll include a link to that article in the show notes. Here's in part what the article says. By the way, one of the first acronyms he uses is RFI, which stands for Radio Frequency Interference. Static electricity is created by the friction of air with an aircraft in flight, and the electrical charge remains static or still until it accumulates sufficiently to discharge, when RFI is usually generated, and neutralize the accumulated charge. When the atmosphere contains particulates such as rain, snow, dust, sand, or volcanic ash, more RFI, precipitation static, is generated as the materials are struck by aircraft surfaces, especially antennas. Flying in rain generally produces only moderate discharges, but heavy discharges can occur when an aircraft is flying in clear air near or between electrically charged clouds or while penetrating storms with electrical activity. Dry snow also leads to discharges. The colder and drier the snow, the greater the discharge. At higher altitudes, the ice crystals found in cirrus clouds can produce massive discharges on aircraft, as can crystals in cold Arctic air masses at lower altitudes. Again, the colder and drier the crystals, the greater the potential for discharge. Another source of RFI that often goes unrecognized is created by the discharge of selectively ionized particles in the engine exhaust. While not as common or as strong as other discharges, it creates RFI that can vary from aircraft to aircraft and engine type to engine type. RFI is most commonly caused by three types of discharges: corona, streamering, and arcing. A corona discharge is luminous and can be audible. A corona, a faint luminous glow adjacent to the affected surface of an aircraft, is created by an electrical discharge that causes ionization of the air in the presence of a strong electrical field. Ionization is caused when the atmosphere is broken down and normally balanced atoms with equally positive and negative charges become unbalanced and carry a positive charge or a negative charge and become capable of carrying an electrical current. The corona on nonmetallic composite radomes, winglets, windshields, and propellers, for example, is also known as St. Elmo's fire. When the charge on an aircraft reaches 100,000 to 200,000 volts, the electrical fields of the aircraft become concentrated on its extremities, wingtips, tail surfaces, etc. The voltage is not lethal because the current level is extremely low. Air is ionized at the sharpest points on these surfaces, and current discharges into the surrounding air, resulting in RFI that causes a hissing noise on a radio receiver. Antennas, particularly those with sharp points, discharge currents that present a strong signal to the VHF receiver. This can cause the automatic gain control to desensitize the receiver, which will remain quiet and be temporarily useless for reception. This is likely to go unrecognized by the pilot until the charge level dissipates sufficiently to allow the receiver to operate properly, and the flight crew may be queried by ATC for not responding to radio calls. This situation occurs more often than commonly recognized and results in removal of equipment for a suspected intermittent receiver problem and a could not duplicate shop report. Arcing is usually caused by the failure of some device installed to reduce precipitation static noise, such as broken bonding straps at control surface hinge points, gear doors, access panels, fuselage cargo and entrance doors. Cracked radome lightning diverter straps and static discharge bases cause arcing. Bonding straps at control surface hinge points are critical. The FAA has published many reports of control surfaces with missing or broken bonding straps that were welded at hinge points or blown completely off the aircraft by lightning strikes. RFI is reduced by preventing the uncontrolled discharge of static electricity from the aircraft to the surrounding air, e.g. the charge is bled into the air mass around the aircraft at a controlled rate by using a discharge device. Now let me jump to an 18-year-old article by Jim Sparks that appeared in aviationpros.com, and I'll also include a link to that article in the show notes. Almost everyone involved in aviation at one time or another has had an encounter with a static discharger or static wick. You know, the device that protrudes from the corner of the wing or some other surface and frequently gets in your path and may on occasion tear your clothes or inflict some wound and often gets broken while positioning the aircraft just prior to a flight. The main purpose of the static discharger is to improve dispersal of accumulated aircraft static charges in an effort to reduce radio interference. Location on the airframe enables them to serve a role as a lightning conductor and provide protection against arcing for surrounding aircraft structure. Static dischargers are replaceable and may be mounted on supports that are attached to the aircraft structure in such a way to ensure adequate electrical contact. Different types of static dischargers are used to alleviate different problems on various types of aircraft. This means a small GA aircraft flying at lower speeds will not use the same type device as a commercial airliner or business jet. Aircraft manufacturers or companies that specialize in aircraft static dissipation should always be consulted when selecting an appropriate device. Static dischargers work on the principle of creating a relatively easy path for dissipating charges that develop on the aircraft by using a device with fine metal points, carbon-pointed rods, or carbon wicks, rather than wait until the large charge is developed and discharged off the trailing edges of the aircraft. A static wick, when working properly, will allow a small but constant stream of electrons to flow to the surrounding air. This process offers various decibel levels of static noise reduction, which can be adapted to different aircraft types to eliminate interference in avionics equipment. Some common symptoms of excessive precipitation static are complete loss or weakening of VHF communications, that would be your comm radios, erroneous magnetic compass readings, high-pitched squeal on audio, static noise in audio, loss of all equipment in clouds, VLF, that would be very low frequency navigation systems intermittent, erratic instruments, St. Elmo's fire on the windshield. Aircraft charging will occur as an aircraft flies through freezing rain, ice crystals, dust, sand, or snow. Contact with these particles leaves a charge on the airframe, and as the aircraft charge builds, a potential is reached where the charge leaks off the aircraft and antennas, creating broadband radio frequency noise. This interferes with ADF, HF, as well as VHF and VOR receivers. Crossfield currents may be created on aircraft flying in clear air beneath a charged cloud layer. And the article then goes into a lot of detail about the many different types of static dischargers or static wicks, and how to use an ohm meter to measure whether they're still working well. For example, the desired resistance for different types of static wicks varies, so you'll first need to know what type of static wicks you have on your airplane to know what the correct resistance should be. And now let me play you that audio clip from the video that I made of a Vision jet climbing out of Van Nuys and encountering P-static. It runs about 4 minutes and begins just before we start getting P-static and ends after it is gone. Note that a few seconds into the clip, you'll hear SoCal Approach calling us, but they're barely audible in the background as the P-static has just begun.
So if we start to pick up ice, what...
if the first sign of ice, I will turn on a wind step.
Sure, what airspeed should we be?
160.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, we'll have some ice, I think. Do you see ice?
Nope, not yet.
When you're able, clear direct
We're having interference direct where? 1 November Pop?
November 1 November Papa, when you're able, cleared direct yak.
The direct yak, 1 November Pop. Let's get up there.
Yep.
Yep.
This is not ice. But in this case, we'll stop at 150 or 190.
No, we're going to 190.
Well, ice.
I see ice, yep. Okay, boots are on. You got the boots on?
Pardon me?
Are the wings tab on?
Yeah.
Oh, good, okay. I'll be watching for the windshield.
Climbing to 4,000.
700 Kilo Foxtrot, take a departure radar contact, climb and maintain 1-3000.
Climb to 3,000.
Here's 71 November Papa SoCal.
SoCal 1 November Pop, we can sometimes hear you calling, but we've got severe interference in the clouds here. Approach 71 November Papa, do you copy now?
1 November Papa, I copy. Direct Yappy and Los Angeles Center, 125.8.
25.8, thanks for your help.
No problem.
Blue Oscar Charlie, descend and maintain 9 or 1,000.
Blue Oscar Charlie, can I maintain a heading of 130?
November 466 Mike Whiskey, how long till you can get back on course?
It'll be a while.
How long?
Probably another 20 miles anyway.
November 466 Mike Whiskey, roger. And who's the other calling?
Yeah, Center, West 1511, leveling 15,000.
West 1511, Los Angeles Center, good afternoon. Higher here in a few minutes. The Burbank altimeter 3006.
3006 for check, West 1511. Zero Oscar Charlie, requesting heading 130 for weather.
Charlie Golf Zulu, Oscar Charlie, contact SoCal approach 124.6. Make the request with them. I can't turn you due to my MIAs in the area.
246, thank you.
Airways Center, Vision Jet 71, November Papa, 18,000 climbing to 19,000.
So our total time without reception was only a couple of minutes, but we went through a fairly small, isolated cell, and you could encounter loss of communications for much longer. The most recent time I encountered P-static and loss of radio reception was in a 2019 Cessna T206, in which I was giving instrument flight instruction in early January. We had widespread IFR conditions with some light rain. We were in and out of the clouds and picked up 1.2 hours of actual instrument time, which is a lot more than we pick up during a typical IFR flight in this area. We briefly picked up heavy rain in the clouds, and sometime around then we experienced P-static for about a minute. Now, I'd read up on P-static since the Vision Jet flight, which had been about 2 months prior, and one of the things I'd read on the COPA forum, the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association, at cirruspilots.org, is that you can sometimes reduce or eliminate the P-static and improve your radio reception by switching to the other COM radio. So if you're using COM 1, switch to COM 2. I didn't try that in the Vision Jet, as I figured, perhaps incorrectly, that the static would be equal on both radios. But in all Cirrus aircraft, and in some other aircraft such as Diamond aircraft, the COM 1 antenna is on the top of the plane, and the COM 2 antenna is on the bottom of the plane. So they're in different enough locations that you might actually be able to reduce P-static interference by switching radios. So having read that, when we encountered P-static in the Cessna 206, I decided to try switching radios, but I didn't really expect it to work, as both the COM 1 and COM 2 antennas are mounted in very similar locations. Of course, for most high-wing Cessnas, both COM antennas are on top of the wing. And sure enough, in the 206, there was no difference in the static levels when I switched between COM 1 and COM 2. But I would encourage you, upon encountering P-static, to try switching COM radios, as it might help somewhat depending upon the plane you're in. Now, here are a few postings I found online from people talking about their P-static experiences. This gentleman who flies a TBM wrote, "Had a memorable experience going into Fort Lauderdale this weekend coming from Puerto Rico. I was IMC at flight level 300 just over Nassau. Thunderstorms embedded in IMC and everyone diverting. No one topping it, just out of NEXRAD range. Onboard radar was required. I have it in the TBM, or you were blind. Miami Center sounded like an auctioneer issuing diversions right and left. Hectic. Then my COM 1 went pure static. Okay, yikes. Took me a beat, but my training kicked in. It's P-static. I switched over to COM 2 and all was good. Radio check with center and continued on. Broke out of a wall of IMC into Florida blue skies." And another pilot wrote, "We have had P-static issues on every composite airplane we have owned. Columbia, SR-22T, SF-50 Gen 1 and SF-50 Gen 2. Our original SR-22T did not have static wicks. Back then, Cirrus claimed they were unnecessary. We ultimately had them installed, along with a number of other improvements under warranty, which did not help at all. We did find on one occasion that running the TKS appeared to help, but it's equally likely that we just flew out of the problem. Great idea when using the sat phone." Now, I'm guessing that's a reference to using a satellite phone to contact ATC if you find you have P-static for a prolonged period and can't hear them on the COM radios. I did find an optional service bulletin, which is supposed to improve static dissipation in older Cirrus piston aircraft. It's SB2X-23-04, and it adds static wicks and a bonding wire, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. And I read across a couple of P-static mentions on the American Bonanza Society website. One pilot wrote, "I have a 1953 K-35 that I fly IFR. I had noticed that reception was horrible after flying in the rain. I added 3 static wick discharges on my Bonanza. None were added to flight control surfaces. I attached one on the aftmost screw on each wingtip and one on the bottom screw attached to my tail cone. This worked very well. The radio reception has remained normal, even in the rain." And then in that same thread, an American Bonanza Society technical advisor wrote, "Everyone, please be aware that if you add or remove static dischargers, the flight control will need to be rebalanced." And someone commented, "I don't understand this. The static wicks are very light. I will give you that the moment arm is long. The length of the aileron, I would guess. Are the ailerons balanced to that tight of a tolerance? Please explain." And the technical advisor went on to explain that yes, even though they weigh about 0.2 ounces, including the mounting hardware, that it can move the rudder vader out of its balance limits by adding it. Someone else wrote that not only does precipitation cause P-static, but many waxes on the aircraft can as well. And from a Cirrus website, this comes from 2019, it said, Cirrus wants to inform owners and position holders on a topic that is gaining considerable interest in aviation, the application of ceramic coatings to aircraft. Cirrus Aircraft does not approve of the use of ceramic coatings on any of its aircraft, including the Vision Jet. Cirrus has reason to believe that significant static issues can occur with the use of a ceramic coating, and we believe the use of these coatings can negatively affect safety of flight. The amount of paint allowed on a particular aircraft is regulated by its square footage. The reason for limiting that thickness is so the airframe can reliably and effectively dissipate P-static. The thickness of your aircraft's primer, base coat, clear coat, etc. is tested and brings it with a known quantity in regards to how P-static will be handled by the airframe. When you apply a ceramic coating, you're adding an additional layer of material and therefore creating a thicker barrier for the static to discharge through. This means that the P-static will remain in on the aircraft instead of being properly discharged. Additionally, ceramic coatings are not created equal. Most are intended for automobiles with no thoughts given to the needs of aircraft. Most of these products feature silicone components in their makeup. Silicone is incompatible with composite aircraft and is prohibited. Silicone-based products can penetrate the composite material of your aircraft. Recently, a Cirrus SR20 G6 aircraft was in service for a P-static issue that didn't exist prior to a ceramic coating application. An extensive amount of time was spent troubleshooting an issue that was not inherent in the airframe. Additional investigation revealed application of a ceramic coating product. Removal of the ceramic coating addressed the P-static issues that the customer was experiencing. The root cause was determined to be the ceramic coating applied to the aircraft, but only after extended downtime and frustration for the customer and thousands of dollars troubleshooting an issue, only to realize it was self-induced by the owner. A P-static event can cause anything from minor radio static to a complete loss of radio communications, loss of engine instruments, navigation signals, etc. And somewhere I read that some Vision Jet pilots believe that they can reduce P-static coming from the radome on the aircraft's nose if they turn on the TKS anti-icing system located on the nose before any ice actually accumulates on the radome and windshield. I don't know if that's actually true, but I wanted to pass it along in case it's something worth trying. And that also makes me wonder if perhaps P-static might be reduced by turning on a TKS system in any TKS-equipped aircraft. If you've ever seen any evidence of that, please let me know. Now, back in 2006, when I went to the Columbia factory in Bend, Oregon, to get factory trained on the Columbia 400, we were told to not bump into the static wicks as we walked around the wings and elevator. It was pointed out to us that normally the static wicks stick straight out from the back of the wings in the elevator. We also saw a static wick that had been bumped into, and it appeared perfectly normal, except that rather than sticking straight out, it was now hanging down at about a 30-degree angle. So it is possible to damage some types of static wicks by bumping into them. On some of the older 172s I used to teach in 20 years ago, it wasn't unusual to see static wicks that had either deteriorated to the point where they were just a set of exposed threads hanging down from the plane, or they were missing entirely. So if you have older static wicks on your plane, you might want to replace them. Also on many high-wing Cessnas, on both ends of the elevator where bolts attach it to the horizontal stabilizer, you'll see a piece of wire braid that runs from the horizontal stabilizer to the elevator. As this wire braid ages and flexes with movement of the elevator, it will eventually break, something I've noted on a number of older Cessnas. If it does, you've just lost the electrical bonding from the aircraft to the elevator, which will greatly reduce the effectiveness of the static wicks on the elevator and increase the chance that you'll get P-static when you fly in the clouds. So if you spot a broken braid wire on either end of the elevator, have it replaced. So in summary, if you encounter P-static, ATC can often hear you even if you can't hear them, so let them know that you're unable to hear due to static. Try switching comm radios, and if the problem persists for more than a few minutes, you might consider squawking 7600. And if you get P-static often when you fly your airplane, consider having the static wicks replaced. If that doesn't solve the problem, you may have to have further work done to reduce the buildup of static in your airplane. And if you've had encounters with P-static, feel free to go ahead and send me an email, share your story. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. And just a quick note that I will be leaving tomorrow, Friday, to head for Knoxville from California in a Vision jet. I'll be there a couple of days and then returning in the same jet. And it looks like we've got 110 knot tailwinds going out. So it's going to be a very short trip going out, but oh boy, looks like a really long trip coming back. Anyway, it should be fun. I'll tell you more about that next week. And I want to thank everyone who contributes to the show in whatever way that you do. Thank you to everyone who says to your friend, hey, you should really check out this podcast. Here's how you can listen to Aviation News Talk. If you haven't done that, please go ahead and do that for someone today. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's baby sliding upside down.